General Hospital spoilers reveal that Willow had always been seen as a symbol of quiet strength, someone who bore her tragedies with grace and steadiness, even when the world around her unraveled. But over time, the weight of unspoken grief and unresolved guilt began to erode the foundation she had built her life upon. She had endured so much: her illness, the loss of Wiley, the breakdown of her marriage to Michael, and the betrayal she felt when the people she trusted turned against her. These weren't just chapters of pain, they were wounds that never healed. And they festered in silence. On the outside, she tried to smile, to continue teaching, to convince herself and everyone else that she was fine. But inside, there was a relentless storm tearing at her every thought, every instinct. The calm she projected had always been fragile, held together by sheer willpower and a desperate hope that something, anything, would make sense again. But nothing did. Her breakdown did not come all at once. It was a slow descent, one that only the most observant noticed. A missed phone call here. A disoriented conversation there, moments when she stared blankly out the window of her apartment for hours as if the world beyond it was no longer real. Carly had been the first to confront her. Gently but firmly, when Willow burst into her home demanding to see the children while still in her tattered wedding dress, mascara streaked down her face like ink bleeding from a broken soul. Carly had stood her ground, trying to reason with Willow, even forcing her to look into the mirror and confront what she had become. But that only shattered what little composure Willow had left. She screamed, pleaded, collapsed into sobs, her voice cracked and raw from nights spent crying alone. That was the moment Michael knew it had gone too far. No custody battle, no courtroom order could prepare a father to watch the mother of his children unravel before his eyes. Even as Willow tried to recover from that episode, the truth was already chasing her down. Drew, ever calculating beneath his facade of stoic concern, began collecting evidence that painted Willow as unstable. Whether it was motivated by guilt, anger, or a desire to regain control over a woman he could no longer reach, no one knew. What was clear was that Drew saw an opportunity to manipulate a narrative where Willow wasn't just erratic, she was dangerous. And then came Daisy. A frightened young girl, barely old enough to speak for herself, claiming that Willow had been following her, watching her from a distance with a strange, obsessive look in her eyes. The reports were dismissed by some, but not by Drew. He weaponized that story, not only to hurt Willow but to try and force her into his version of a future they could rebuild. But Willow was no longer capable of choosing a future. She was lost in the past, haunted by memories that twisted into hallucinations, and the people she once trusted now appeared to her as shadows with ulterior motives. The day they came for her, the silence was deafening. Carly had tried to intervene, pleading with the hospital board to delay the decision. Michael, torn between loyalty to the woman he once loved and the safety of his children, stood with his head bowed as the white coats entered Willow's apartment. She didn't fight. She laughed. A dry, broken laugh that chilled everyone in the room. "So it's finally happening," she said, almost serenely, as if she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. "They said Ferncliff would help her. That she would be cared for, that she could rest." But Willow knew what Ferncliff was. It wasn't a place of rest. It was a cage for those too broken to fit into society's tidy narratives. Inside Ferncliff, time lost meaning. The walls were too white, too clean, as if they were trying to scrub away the madness that clung to the very air. Willow was given a room with no windows and a bed too firm to feel like comfort. Her journal was confiscated. Her phone, gone. Her only contact with the outside world was through short, supervised visits that felt more like interrogations than conversations. Michael visited once. He couldn't meet her eyes. She asked about the children, and he hesitated before answering. A moment of silence that told her more than words ever could. She was no longer part of their lives. That realization nearly broke her again. Then came the therapy sessions. Polite questions disguised as clinical evaluation. They wanted to understand her delusions, to identify the root of her obsession with Daisy. But Willow couldn't explain what even she didn't understand. She remembered seeing Daisy in the park and feeling an overwhelming sense of familiarity, a deep, inexplicable connection. She swore she had seen Daisy with someone she recognized, someone from her past, but no one believed her. They chalked it up to paranoia, another sign of her deteriorating state. But Willow clung to those memories, even as the medications dulled her mind. She needed them to be real, because if they weren't, then she truly had lost everything. Outside Ferncliff, Drew's narrative began to shift. He claimed he never wanted her locked up, that it was the system's decision, not his. But Curtis knew the truth. He had seen the manipulation in Drew's eyes. The way he planted seeds of doubt in Michael's mind, in Carly's. Curtis confided in Nina, who began to question everything. Was Drew using mental health as a weapon? And if so, how many others had he silenced under the guise of concern? But by then, it was too late. Willow was gone, buried behind walls that few ever returned from. Inside, Willow began to change. The first few weeks were a blur, but then something shifted. The chaos gave way to clarity, the pain to purpose. She began to write again, not in journals but in her mind. Entire novels composed in silence. She remembered who she was, who she had been before love and loss had broken her. She realized she had been manipulated, not just by Drew, but by a world that demanded perfection and punished fragility. Ferncliff didn't cure her. It stripped away the noise. And beneath that noise was a woman who had survived. Word began to spread. Carly heard whispers from a nurse. Michael received a letter he was certain Willow had written. Even Nina, haunted by guilt, began pressing for visitation rights. The people who had abandoned her were now seeking to understand her. But Willow was no longer seeking their validation. She had changed. She wasn't the fragile woman crying on Carly's floor. She was something new. Something unshakable. And as she stood by the barred window of her room, staring at the sliver of sky above, she knew that the world would one day hear her truth. Because she hadn't lost her mind. She had lost her voice. And now, for the first time in a long time, she was ready to speak. And when she did, everything would change. The people who locked her away would have to face what they had done. Drew, with his careful lies and smug righteousness. Michael, with his silence and betrayal. Carly, with her judgment disguised as concern. None of them would walk away clean. Ferncliff may have been meant to silence her, but instead, it gave her something she hadn't had in a long time, clarity. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning. And when Willow walked out of Ferncliff, whether it was weeks or months from now, she wouldn't be the same. She would be stronger. Smarter. And she would remember. Every lie. Every betrayal. Every person who left her behind. She would remember, and she would return, not to reclaim what was lost, but to rebuild something new. Something unbreakable. Because she had finally learned the truth, they didn't fear her madness. They feared her strength. Michael was once the pillar of calm in a world often dictated by chaos. But now he found himself at the helm of a storm, determined to seize control in ways he never imagined. The fragile remnants of his once deep love for Willow had dissolved under the weight of her unraveling mind, and all that remained was his fierce instinct to protect Wiley and Amelia at all costs. What began as heartbreak had now evolved into something more complex, an internal war between compassion and the icy clarity of necessity. Michael wasn't just stepping in as a father. He was stepping up as a gatekeeper, a silent sentinel guarding the children from dangers too dark and erratic to allow even a sliver of risk. And to his horror, the danger now bore the face of the woman who had once cradled those same children with tenderness, Willow. She had spiraled out of control in a way no one close to her could have anticipated. There were flashes of clarity, moments where she looked like herself again, sounded like herself, even breathed with the rhythm of the Willow they had known. But those moments were fleeting. In their place was a woman haunted by delusions, chasing shadows, believing that Daisy, an innocent child herself, was somehow tied to a vast conspiracy of betrayal and secrecy. It wasn't just erratic behavior anymore. It was obsession. And Michael, watching from the sidelines as she crumbled in Carly's living room in a tattered wedding dress, knew something irreversible had occurred. Willow wasn't safe. Not for herself. Not for Wiley. Not for anyone. And so the walls began to go up, not around the children, but around Willow. It wasn't cruel, Michael told himself. It was precaution. He wasn't being vindictive. He was being responsible. At least that's what he whispered late at night when the guilt crept in like a fog. Carly supported his decision, though she was torn in her own way. She had loved Willow once too, had trusted her. But the woman who had once stood strong in the face of leukemia now stood lost in a whirlwind of hallucinations and paranoia. The heartbreak of it all only reinforced the need to act quickly. That heartbreak bled into resolve, and that resolve hardened into action. Michael filed for a court order, temporary suspension of Willow's visitation rights pending psychiatric evaluation. The hearing was short, clinical, void of the emotion that cracked through Michael's voice behind closed doors. He presented the documentation, her outburst, the incident with Daisy. The testimonies from both Carly and Drew. It was enough. The judge ruled in his favor. And just like that, a new wall was built. A legal boundary separating Willow from her children. A line drawn in ink but etched into Michael's conscience with something much deeper. And the moment the gavel came down, something inside Willow shattered. Word of the ruling reached her while she was still under psychiatric observation. The staff had tried to soften the blow, but there was no sugarcoating the truth. She had lost her children. Not forever, they said. Just for now. But Willow knew better. Just for now was how the world masked irreversible things. She didn't scream or sob. She went quiet. Too quiet. A silence that terrified the staff more than any fit of rage. The silence of someone who had finally given up. The silence of someone who had nothing left to lose. This was the final fracture, the one that pushed her from grief into complete emotional paralysis. She stopped eating. She stopped speaking. She began to sleep through the day and stare at the ceiling all night. Nurses whispered about Ferncliff, about long-term care. Drew visited once, trying to reason with her. Even daring to suggest that this was all temporary. But Willow's expression never changed. She looked at Drew as if he were a stranger, a figure carved from the same delusions she once feared. Nina came too. She cried. She begged for forgiveness. She told Willow she had tried to take the blame for the Daisy situation, tried to protect her. But Willow couldn't even hear her anymore. She was drifting too far. Michael heard about her silence secondhand. He asked himself whether he had pushed too hard, too fast. But every time he began to doubt, he saw Wiley's smile. Heard Amelia's laughter, and reminded himself why he made the choice. The children were safe. That was all that mattered. Even if it meant sacrificing the woman he once believed would be his forever. Even if it meant watching her unravel completely while standing just out of reach. And yet, what none of them realized was that something far more dangerous was building inside Willow, not rage. Not sorrow, but clarity. A clarity born of devastation. She began to see the chessboard for what it was. Every move, every betrayal, every manipulation. Drew hadn't just exposed her instability, he had orchestrated it. Michael hadn't just protected his children, he had exiled their mother. Carly hadn't just intervened, she had passed judgment. And the world had cheered them on, all under the guise of love and safety. One night, in the sterile quiet of her room, Willow finally spoke. Just one sentence. I see them now. It startled the nurse so deeply she dropped the clipboard. From that moment on, Willow's silence ended. She began to talk again. Slowly at first, answering questions, eating meals. Then came writing. Pages and pages of thoughts, some lucid, some cryptic. but all of them marked with a strange, quiet intensity. The staff at Ferncliff thought she was improving. They called it progress. But Willow knew better. She wasn't healing. She was remembering. She was remembering how they took everything. How they isolated her. How they turned her pain into a weapon. And most of all, she remembered what it felt like to be loved, and how easily that love turned into fear. Into abandonment. Into control. Michael had created a system of protection. He had walled off his family to keep them safe. But in doing so, he had lit the match that would set everything ablaze. The pain he thought he was ending had only begun to take shape. And Willow, once the fragile heart of his world, was now becoming something else entirely, something sharp, unyielding, and inevitable. This wasn't the end of Willow's story. This was her rebirth. Her descent into darkness wasn't a fall, it was a transformation. And when she emerged, no wall would be high enough, no order strong enough, to keep her from reclaiming what was stolen. The final act had yet to be written, but the tragedy was already in motion. And everyone who had tried to save her, would soon learn what it meant to break her. Drew had become a man unrecognizable to those who once trusted him, a ghost of what he used to be, hollowed out by ambition, betrayal, and a need for control that now dictated every breath he took. Where once there was tenderness in his eyes for Willow, there now lived a calculated coldness, a gaze sharpened by manipulation and masked behind soft tones and false empathy. What began as a complicated love triangle had evolved into something far more dangerous, a game of perception and control where Willow was no longer a participant but a target. He no longer viewed her as a partner or a mother to his stepchildren. She had become an obstacle, a liability, a vulnerable thread dangling on the edge of his neatly constructed life. And in a world where Drew could not afford instability, he set his sights on dismantling Willow's voice, her mind, her very sense of reality. Willow's collapse had not happened overnight. It was a gradual erosion, orchestrated with surgical precision. Drew knew her weaknesses, the trauma of losing her parents, the guilt she carried over her past with Nina. The anxiety of motherhood under public scrutiny. He used them all. At first, it was subtle, an offhand comment about her memory, quiet concerns whispered into Michael's ear. But behind closed doors, Drew was planting fear, cultivating the narrative that Willow was slipping, that her episodes were more frequent, more dangerous. And eventually, that narrative took root. Michael, already wrestling with his own guilt over the collapse of their marriage, was easy to sway. Drew reminded him of Daisy, how Willow had appeared at Carly's house in a wedding dress, rambling about reunification and clutching at ghosts. He recalled how she had pushed her way into the house, demanding to see the children, insisting that she heard Wiley calling for her. Even when Wiley had never spoken a word. Michael remembered the tear-streaked face, the glassy eyes, the smudged lipstick of a woman on the brink. And he felt terror. He had children to protect. A life to preserve. And so, slowly, painfully, he began to believe that maybe Drew was right. Maybe Willow did need help. Maybe love wasn't enough anymore. But Willow knew the truth. She felt it in her bones, that creeping shadow that followed her through the empty halls of her house, in the phone calls that stopped without warning. In the way Carly no longer returned her messages, in the way Wiley pulled away when she leaned in to kiss him. She saw it in the eyes of the people around her, eyes that used to look at her with trust. Now clouded with suspicion. She wasn't unraveling. She was being unraveled. And then came Ferncliff. The word had been whispered like a threat. Like a curse spoken in the corners of rooms she wasn't meant to enter. But it was real. She found the paperwork one night in Drew's briefcase, a psychiatric hold form, unsigned but ready. With her name printed in bold, black ink. It was a betrayal beyond comprehension. This was no intervention. This was an execution of character, of identity, of autonomy. And when she confronted him, his calm demeanor chilled her to the core. He didn't deny it. He only said, "It's for your own good, Willow. You'll thank me someday." That night, she didn't sleep. Her hands trembled as she locked every window and door, her heart racing with the knowledge that her world was being stolen from her inch by inch. And she was powerless to stop it. Every attempt to defend herself was twisted, every emotional plea used as proof of instability. Drew had constructed a trap so airtight that every protest only tightened the walls around her. Even Nina, who once might have been an ally, was now silent, distant, her own guilt tying her hands. In her desperation, Willow turned to Jason, the only person who ever truly saw through the masks. But Jason was gone, swallowed by the same machinery that was now grinding her down. Liesel was unreachable, and Carly was complicit. Even Christina, once her champion, had grown quiet. She had nowhere left to go, no hand left to hold. The world had moved on without her, and she was left staring into the void. When they finally came for her, it was under the guise of compassion. A quiet conversation, a soft touch on the arm, a tranquilizer masked as a vitamin. They told her it would be quick, that Ferncliff was not what it used to be, that she would be safe. But she knew better. She knew what Ferncliff meant. She knew the stories of padded cells, of lights that never dimmed, of voices that echoed endlessly off sterile walls. It wasn't a place of healing, it was a place where people disappeared. And she almost did. The first days were the hardest. The disorientation, the silence. The way her cries were met with indifference or needles. They stripped her of her name, her belongings, her past. They called her Patient 23. They monitored her every word, her every breath. And each visit from Drew was a performance. He brought her flowers, whispered false promises, told her that Michael still cared, that Wiley asked about her. He painted a fantasy she couldn't escape because she had no proof that any of it was false. But Willow was not gone. Not yet. Somewhere deep inside her. Beneath the sedatives and the gaslighting and the despair, a spark still lived. She clung to it in the dark, nurtured it with memories of holding Wiley's hand, of Amelia's laugh. Of a life where she had once been seen and loved and believed. And that spark began to grow. She started writing, carving truths into the corners of the mattress. Into the backs of envelopes they forgot to check. She memorized routines, security lapses, the times nurses changed shifts. She listened, not just to the guards, but to the other patients. The ones who had also been erased. And she planned. Because Willow had lost everything, but not her will to fight. She would not let Drew be her ending. She would not let Ferncliff become her grave. She would escape, not just for herself, but for every woman who had ever been told she was crazy for seeing what others refused to see. She would take back her name, her voice, her children. And when she returned, she would bring the truth with her like a sword. Because Drew thought he had buried her. But all he had done was plant her deeper. And Willow was ready to rise.